On the 22nd of September 2025, the world did not simply hear an announcement, it felt a tremor. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré declared a partnership with Zimbabwean inventor Maxwell Chikumbutso, unveiling an experiment that promised to turn invisible radio waves into power. For some, it was genius, a torch to lift 600 million Africans still waiting in the dark. For others, it was folly, a dangerous gamble that could bankrupt a nation already burdened by scarcity. This was not just about electricity, it was about sovereignty. For decades, Burkina Faso had bent under the weight of imported fuel, its hospitals silenced, its classrooms dimmed, its soldiers stranded whenever the convoys were stopped at the border. Now, with one act of defiance, Traoré placed his country on a collision course with history. The question is as stark as the desert night. Is this the birth of an African revolution in energy, or the beginning of a perilous descent? Do not turn away. This is more than a headline, it is a homecoming. For every son and daughter of Africa scattered across the world, this story is your story. Subscribe, share, and let us journey together towards the light of freedom. Burkina Faso is a landlocked nation, but its isolation has never been merely geographical. For generations, its lifeline has been tethered to convoys of fuel crossing fragile borders. More than 80% of its energy is drawn from imported diesel and petroleum. Every time those convoys stall, silence descends. Hospital wards lose their hum, classrooms fall into darkness, military outposts stand blind. In those moments, sovereignty is not an ideal. It is a candle snuffed out by dependence. On the 22nd of September 2025, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before his ministers and declared that this cycle could not continue. Our hospitals cannot beg for diesel. Our children cannot study by candlelight. Our soldiers cannot defend a nation paralyzed by shortages. His words were not mere frustration, they were defiance. They echoed with the same audacity that once placed men on the moon, but spoken not in Washington nor Moscow, but in Ouagadougou. That evening, his government unveiled its boldest step yet. An agreement with Zimbabwean inventor Maxwell Chikumbutso, a man both celebrated and scorned. Maxwell had grown up in the townships of Harare, dropped out of school at 14, and taught himself the mysteries of wires and waves in a cluttered garage. By the time others his age sought work, he claimed to have built machines that confounded orthodox science. A self-charging electric car, drones that flew for days, a television powered by nothing more than the invisible radio frequencies in the air. Scientists abroad dismissed him. The laws of thermodynamics, they said, could not be rewritten in a backyard. Western journals ignored him. Universities scoffed. Yet in the eyes of Traoré, Maxwell was not a charlatan. He was a chance to sever the chains of imported fuel. A chance to give power to the 600 million Africans still consigned to darkness. On the night of the 23rd of September, deep beneath the presidential palace, that chance was put to the test. Generals, ministers, and engineers gathered in a bunker carved from concrete. In the center of the room sat a device no larger than a suitcase, plain and unadorned, with a single green indicator light. Maxwell's hands, scarred from years of tinkering, hovered over the switch. The chamber fell silent. Then, with a soft click, the device came alive. For 30 long seconds, nothing. Then the bulbs overhead flickered, once, twice, and then blazed into brilliance. Consoles lit up. Monitors glowed. The air filled with the hum of power. Gasps echoed through the room. A general whispered, "To do this with diesel, we would need 25 liters every hour." Suspicion mingled with awe. Was this the spark of liberation, or a trick too dangerous to trust? Traoré's voice cut through the murmurs. "If we master this, Africa will never kneel again, neither before oil nor before the IMF." It was more than a proclamation. It was a challenge to the world order that had defined Africa's place for decades. Outside, the city of Ouagadougou remained unaware of what had transpired beneath its streets. But within that bunker, a seed had been planted, a seed that could grow into a harvest of freedom, or wither under the glare of skepticism and sabotage. Was this the first light of a new dawn, or a fragile glow destined to be snuffed out by forces far beyond Burkina Faso's walls? News does not wait for borders. By dawn on the 23rd of September, whispers from the bunker had already leaked into the bloodstream of the world's media. Headlines blazed across screens from Washington to Beijing. Burkina Faso tests infinite energy generator. What had begun as a flicker in an underground chamber now threatened to ignite a global storm. The first shock was felt in the markets. Brent crude tumbled by 20% in a single day. Tech giants, Tesla, Panasonic, CATL, watched $150 billion vanish from their market value. Investors fled oil stocks as if fleeing a sinking ship. Hope and fear traded places in real time. For 600 million Africans living without reliable electricity, this was deliverance. For the guardians of the old order, it was destabilization. In Washington, emergency briefings ran through the night. Was Maxwell Chikumbutso a fraud, or worse, was he genuine? If real, the implications were catastrophic for a 70-year system built on oil routes, naval patrols, and loan conditions. Former President Donald Trump, in comments swiftly picked up by the media, thundered, "If Burkina Faso and Africa break away from the orbit of the G7, the entire 70-year order will collapse." The word struck like a cannon shot across the Atlantic. In Paris, indignation flared. Commentators warned that Ouagadougou was toying with illusions that could unravel West Africa. French media derided Traoré's gamble as reckless. In Moscow, by contrast, state channels praised him as a young lion who dared to roar against the West. Strategists calculated how free African power could unsettle OPEC and forge new alliances. Beijing, ever pragmatic, dispatched envoys offering factories, infrastructure, and markets if Burkina Faso would align itself with China's Belt and Road. Yet the most dramatic twist came not through diplomacy, but through clandestine pressure. Agents from the CIA and France's DGSE approached Maxwell with an offer. $20 billion, an astronomical sum equal to his host nation's GDP, if he would hand over his patents and walk away. Maxwell refused. Standing beside Traoré, he declared, "This is not for sale. This is Africa's freedom." With that, the line was drawn. The matter was no longer about engineering or economics. It was about sovereignty. But destiny rarely comes unchallenged. That same evening, a sudden explosion ripped through one of Ouagadougou's key laboratories. Flames engulfed prototypes, documents, and months of fragile research. Windows shattered, smoke billowed, and suspicion spread like wildfire. To some, it was evidence of sabotage, the hand of unseen powers unwilling to allow Africa to rise. To others, it was proof of incompetence that the technology itself was unstable. Maxwell emerged from the wreckage, his hands burned but his resolve unbroken. "You can destroy our labs," he told the cameras, "but you cannot destroy an idea whose time has come." Across the continent, reactions polarized. In Bamako and Conakry, editorials hailed Traoré as the Mandela of a new energy age. Calls rose for a Pan-African energy alliance with Ouagadougou at its heart. In other capitals, caution prevailed. Economists warned of financial ruin if the gamble failed. Opposition leaders in Burkina Faso spoke on state radio, insisting, "If this collapses, we will be isolated, mocked, and poorer than before." Even within the military, doubts lingered. Was the nation painting a target on its back? Still, for millions watching the green glow of Maxwell's generator, doubts could not drown dreams. Mothers imagined incubators never again silenced. Teachers saw classrooms freed from kerosene smoke. Farmers pictured silos powered against the heat. In their eyes, the impossible had already begun. But could hope, however radiant, withstand the flames of sabotage and the fury of global powers determined to keep Africa in the dark? In the days that followed the explosion, Burkina Faso became a nation suspended between two realities: the glow of a machine that promised liberation and the ashes of a laboratory that whispered ruin. For ordinary citizens, the tension was visceral. Mothers in crowded maternity wards asked whether incubators would ever again fall silent. Teachers looked at their students by candlelight and imagined the steady beam of electric lamps. Farmers, weary of losing harvests to the heat, wondered if silos could one day be powered against decay. To them, the promise was no longer theoretical. It was intimate, human, urgent. But as hope spread through the streets, so too did unease. Economists and former ministers took to the airwaves, warning of catastrophe. "If we gamble on unproven technology," one declared on state radio, "we risk isolation, humiliation, and bankruptcy." Their caution resonated in markets already strained by the plunge in oil prices and the volatility unleashed across global exchanges. Even within the ranks of the military, unease lingered. Some officers whispered that Burkina Faso was painting a bullseye on its chest, tempting foreign sabotage or worse, intervention. Inside government, the divide ran deep. For Traoré and his inner circle, to continue importing fuel was to accept a slow death. To risk everything on Maxwell's vision was, at the very least, a chance at life. That conviction resonated with a nation long accustomed to coups, droughts, and hardship. For them, sovereignty was not abstract. It was bread on the table, light in the schoolhouse, power in the command center. Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the ripple effects were impossible to ignore. At the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, alarm bells rang. Their leverage over much of the global south rested on resource scarcity. Loans and interest payments depended on nations needing oil, diesel, or foreign infrastructure. But if a suitcase-sized device could power entire villages, the very foundation of their authority would fracture. The guardians of the old order saw not innovation, but insurrection. Meanwhile, across Africa, debates grew heated. Some leaders hailed the development as the first stone of an African revolution in energy, an uprising not of armies, but of technology. Others feared that a failed gamble would embolden skeptics who already dismissed Africa as a continent of illusions. The stakes were not just material, they were psychological. If Burkina Faso succeeded, it could lift the morale of a continent. If it failed, it could deepen the chains of doubt. Among citizens, the debate was deeply personal. A father in Bobo Dioulasso asked on radio, "Do we live in fear of mockery, or do we dare to dream of light?" Students in Ouagadougou scrawled slogans on university walls. "Energy is freedom." Women in rural villages lit kerosene lamps and wondered aloud whether their daughters would be the last generation to breathe in smoke just to see at night. This was more than a technical argument. It was existential. Would Burkina Faso remain forever at the mercy of stalled convoys and foreign contracts? Or would it claim the dignity of self-reliance? Would it kneel before the dictates of others, or would it stand, even if standing meant risking everything? And yet, beneath the fervor, fear persisted. What if the explosion was not sabotage, but proof the technology itself was unstable? What if the hope was misplaced? The dream too fragile to survive scrutiny? Each whisper of doubt tugged at the fragile thread holding optimism aloft. Still, in Ouagadougou, Traoré and Maxwell pressed on. Their gamble had already rewritten the narrative. Even if the machine failed tomorrow, they had forced the world to reckon with a new possibility: that Africa could chart its own path, not as a beggar for aid, but as a pioneer of independence. But as the debates raged, a darker question loomed. Would the old guardians of power allow Burkina Faso to choose its destiny, or would they move to crush the vision before it could take root? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the tremors of September 2025 reverberated like an earthquake through diplomatic halls. Each power bloc, each institution, saw not only a device in a bunker but a challenge to their influence, their markets, their vision of the century ahead. In Africa itself, the reaction split into two clear camps. Nations such as Mali, Niger, and Guinea, long weary of foreign dictates, voiced open solidarity. Editorials across West African newspapers hailed Ibrahim Traoré as the Mandela of the energy age, daring to claim a future no longer tethered to oil tankers or loan contracts. Some commentators even urged the creation of a Pan-African energy alliance, with Ouagadougou as its symbolic capital. Others, however, whispered caution. Could one small state risk dragging an entire region into instability if the gamble faltered? In Washington, analysts pored over intelligence briefings with grim urgency. America's dominance since the Second World War had rested on two pillars: unmatched military power and the control of global energy flows. Oil routes guarded by its navy, shipping lanes policed by its alliances, and financial institutions headquartered in New York and Washington had ensured compliance. But if a landlocked nation in the Sahel could produce endless power from the air, the very foundations of that dominance cracked. For policymakers, the dilemma was acute. Embrace Traoré and risk legitimizing unproven science, or discredit him and risk standing against an African dream. Either choice carried peril. Paris reacted with fury. French commentators warned of grave consequences should Burkina Faso persist. For France, the spectacle of a former colony charting a revolutionary course was not only humiliating but dangerous, undermining its sway over Francophone Africa. Brussels, more cautious, spoke in the language of stability and regional risk, hesitant to either embrace or condemn. Yet among ordinary Europeans, burdened by high energy costs, whispers grew. What if this technology reached us too? Moscow seized the moment with relish. State broadcasters lionized Traoré as a bold young lion, while strategists calculated how a liberated Africa might weaken OPEC's grip and create new partnerships. Beijing, ever pragmatic, saw opportunity where others saw disruption. Envoys quietly proposed infrastructure deals, market access, and joint factories, promising that alignment with China's Belt and Road could secure both investment and protection. International institutions were no less unsettled. The World Bank and the IMF, whose leverage rested on scarcity, recognized the existential threat. If Maxwell's generators could illuminate villages without loans, the very architecture of debt and dependency would falter. Their influence, honed over decades, might evaporate overnight. Thus, Ouagadougou became more than a capital. It became a fault line in West Africa politics, a place where visions of the future collided. For some, it was salvation. For others, it was disruption, but no one could look away. Would the world extend a hand of partnership to a rising Africa, or tighten its grip to prevent a new order from breaking through? As the smoke of the laboratory fire thinned and the headlines shifted from shock to speculation, Burkina Faso stood at a crossroads. The future stretched before it like a forked road across the Sahel, one path toward sovereignty, the other toward ruin. Which direction would history record? The first path was that of triumph. If Maxwell's invention proved stable, if prototypes could be scaled and defended, then a nation long dismissed as marginal could become the epicenter of a new energy era. Schools would glow with steady light. Hospitals would never again plead for diesel. Farmers would store grain in powered silos. Soldiers would guard borders without fear of darkness. More than that, Burkina Faso could inspire an entire continent. It would prove that dignity was not given by others but claimed by one's own hands. The second path was peril. Should the machines fail, should sabotage succeed, the nation could find itself ridiculed, abandoned by lenders, and trapped in deeper poverty than before. The ridicule of foreign commentators, the withdrawal of partners, the tightening of sanctions, these were dangers as real as any explosion. Yet the choice could not be avoided. To remain bound to imported fuel was to accept a slow death. To gamble on innovation was to risk everything, yet also to open the door to possibility. That tension, between fear and hope, between caution and courage, defined every conversation in Ouagadougou and beyond. For Traoré, the wager was larger than kilowatts or generators. It was a declaration that Africa would no longer accept its destiny being dictated in boardrooms in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. For Maxwell, scarred but unbroken, the struggle was not about patents or wealth, but about proving that even a boy from Harare's townships could light a continent. And for millions watching the faint green glow of that suitcase-sized device, the meaning was simpler still. If light could come from the air, then perhaps dignity could come from within. The glow remains, but will it burn long enough to guide Africa's future, or fade into the embers of a dream too bold for the world to accept? The story of Burkina Faso in September 2025 was never just about a machine. It was about a nation daring to dream against the weight of history. In the silence of fuel shortages, in the darkness of powerless wards and classrooms, a president and an inventor stood side by side and declared that dependency would no longer define them. They lit more than bulbs in a bunker. They lit a question that cannot be extinguished. If one small, landlocked nation can challenge the logic of an entire century, what stops the rest of Africa? The answer lies not in the corridors of the IMF, nor in the trading floors of oil markets, but in the choices of ordinary people, leaders, and visionaries who decide whether sovereignty is worth the risk. That is the essence of an African revolution. Not simply to resist, but to reimagine. Not to wait, but to create. For Burkina Faso, the stakes remain immense. Failure would invite mockery, punishment, and perhaps isolation. But success would mean light in villages long forgotten, dignity for millions who have endured scarcity, and proof that the continent can write its own chapter. This is not merely about wires and engines. It is about pride, freedom, and the promise of a future shaped by African hands. And so the question reaches beyond Ouagadougou, beyond the Sahel, beyond the laboratories and palaces. What world will we choose to build? Will we defend the old order of scarcity, or will we stand with those who dare to build abundance? Will West Africa politics continue to be scripted elsewhere, or will Africans write their own script at last? If you believe that light is more than electricity, that it is dignity, sovereignty, and hope, then do not let this story fade. Share it, comment your vision, and subscribe to keep walking with us. Together we carry the torch of an African revolution, not as spectators but as participants in a continent's awakening.